For every successful second and third generation star in the WWE like Randy Orton and Cody Rhodes, there are dozens who failed to live up to their family legacy. From The Rock's daughter to Ric Flair's son, from failed members of the bloodline to third-generation stars landing in prison, these are the biggest failed products of nepotism in WWE history. Kicking things off with arguably the most high-profile recent example, the daughter of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Ava Raine. Ava came from the richest bloodline in wrestling history. The Rock is arguably the biggest crossover star pro wrestling has ever produced. His father, Rocky Johnson, was part of one of the most legendary tag teams in WWE history. His grandfather was a legendary figure in Hawaii and the Pacific. And through her bloodline, Ava is related to Roman Reigns, the Usos, Solo Sikoa, Umaga, basically half the Samoan dynasty. She signed with WWE in 2020 and debuted on NXT in late 2022 as Ava Raine, the fourth member of Joe Gacy's faction. She was positioned as a manager and occasional in-ring competitor. She wrestled a grand total of 4 matches, and her most notable singles match was a loss to Ivy Nile at NXT Heatwave in 2023. That was essentially the end of her in-ring story. It was clear that she didn't have the athletic ability or the charisma that her father possessed. After that, WWE pivoted her to an authority figure role. By the end of 2023, she was Shawn Michaels' assistant, and by 2024, she was named the general manager of NXT. Throughout her run as NXT GM, fans and journalists criticized her for her dry personality and polarizing political opinions that they thought didn't belong in the wrestling world. But here's where it gets interesting. In January 2026, Ava announced she would not be renewing her contract, ending a 6-year run with the company. In 6 years, the daughter of the most electrifying man in sports entertainment never had a single meaningful in-ring victory. She went from developmental talent to management figure so fast that nobody ever got the chance to find out if she could actually wrestle. Whether the door revolves back to wrestling or she moves on entirely, her WWE chapter feels like a draft that never became a finished story. But speaking of finishing stories, let's talk about a guy whose story had a genuinely dark ending that nobody saw coming. Ted Jr. came from wrestling royalty. His grandfather was a legit tough guy in the territorial era. His father, the $1 Million Man, was one of the greatest heels in wrestling history. The family name alone carried enormous weight. Ted signed with WWE in 2007 and came up through Florida Championship Wrestling. His debut on Raw in May 2008 was a statement. Within weeks, he was already a tag team champion alongside Cody Rhodes, and also sharing the ring with big names like John Cena and Batista. WWE even cast him in The Marine 2, which tells you exactly how much they believed in him as a future face of the company. Then he joined The Legacy alongside Randy Orton and Cody Rhodes, and it looks like everything was on track. The faction became a key part of Monday Night Raw in 2009 and feuded with high-profile names such as Triple H and Shawn Michaels. The problem was that when Legacy dissolved, Ted Jr. didn't have the intangible factor to carry himself as a singles star. His father's $1 Million Man gimmick was handed to him, including bringing back the actual $1 Million Championship and hiring Virgil as a bodyguard. But it went nowhere. He bounced around the midcard, partnered with Mrs. Wife, had some brief feuds over the US title, got lost, and quietly let his contract expire in September 2013, later revealing that mental health issues played a major role in his decision to walk away from a 5-year extension. After this, he essentially retired from wrestling. For a while, it seemed like Ted Jr. had decided to live a modest life working a modest job away from the limelight. But then, in 2022, his story took a genuinely shocking turn. Ted Jr., his father, and his brother Brett were sued by the Mississippi Department of Human Services for allegedly misusing over $20 million from a welfare fund. In 2023, Ted Jr. was federally indicted on charges including conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering. However, most fans forget that Ted wasn't the only member of Legacy who failed. And while Ted Jr. at least had a legit run in wrestling, the next guy on our list barely got a cup of coffee before WWE showed him the door. Alongside Cody Rhodes and Ted Jr., Manu was a member of the OG Legacy faction. His father, Afa, is one half of the Wild Samoans, one of the most influential tag teams in WWE history. The family tree includes The Rock, Roman Reigns, the Usos, Yokozuna, Umaga, Rikishi. The list goes on. Afa Jr. debuted as a teenager in 1998 and spent years on the independent circuit before getting a developmental deal with WWE in 2006. He went through Deep South Wrestling and Florida Championship Wrestling, even winning the FCW Southern Heavyweight Championship. By September 2008, he was on the main roster under the name Manu, aligned with Cody Rhodes and Ted Jr., with Randy Orton circling the group as a mentor figure. The plan was to have all three young multi-generational stars graduate into the legacy. But backstage, opinions of Manu soured quickly. He was criticized internally for his physical conditioning and told by Jim Ross in a public blog at the time that he needed to lose weight. Reports later surfaced that Orton himself felt Manu hadn't paid his dues and had a poor attitude backstage. On February 23, 2009, barely 5 months into his main roster run, Manu was released. Since then, he's spent years bouncing around regional promotions on the indie circuit. He and his brother L.A. Smooth had multiple tag title reigns in World Wrestling Council. As of January 2026, he's still active on the indie scene, but Manu's WWE window opened and closed in the span of a single season. Going from a guy who had the bloodline but couldn't get traction, let's talk about someone who was handed everything and still failed. Ric Flair is arguably one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. 16 world championships, legendary matches, iconic factions. In terms of in-ring charisma, promo ability, and long-term consistency, Ric Flair set the standard that everyone else chases. Unfortunately, his son David had absolutely none of it. And to be fair to David, he never really wanted any of it. By his own admission and by what Ric Flair wrote in his autobiography, David's childhood dream was to become a state trooper, not a wrestler. But WCW was dying in 1998 and desperate for anything that could generate attention, so they put Ric Flair's kid on television with barely any training and just hoped the name would do the work. David debuted in a tag match alongside his father at WCW Sold Out in January 1999. Within months, WCW had made him the youngest United States champion in company history. Not because he earned it, but because Ric Flair, as on-screen WCW president, just handed it to him. He won matches with help from Arn Anderson. He got carried by better wrestlers wherever he went. And his run with Crowbar and Daphne in 2000 was probably his most tolerable stretch because the faction's chaos hid how green he was. When WCW folded in 2001, WWE picked up his contract and sent him to Ohio Valley Wrestling. He spent about 18 months there, made 2 brief appearances on WWE television, both of which involved The Undertaker roughing him up as part of a feud with his father, and was quietly released in late 2002. He had a short TNA run in late 2002 and early 2003, joined Vince Russo's faction briefly, and then drifted through the independent circuit before wrestling his last match in 2008. Today, David Flair works as a manager at a copper and steel wire company in North Carolina. He's married with 2 kids. By all accounts, he's happy. And honestly, given how badly his wrestling career went for someone who didn't really want to be there in the first place, that might be the best outcome he could have hoped for. The lesson of David Flair isn't that nepotism failed him. It's that nepotism pushed him into an industry he was never built for, and the results were painful to watch. But while David Flair at least tasted championship gold in a major promotion like WCW, the next person on our list had all the tools to become wrestling's biggest female star, but burned every bridge she crossed. Tessa Blanchard comes from one of wrestling's most legendary families. Her grandfather, Joe Blanchard, founded Southwest Championship Wrestling in Texas in the 1960s. Her father, Tully Blanchard, was one of the Four Horsemen, one of the most prestigious factions in wrestling history. Tessa trained at High Spots Wrestling School at age 18, kept her plans secret from her family at first, and grinded the independent scene for years before anyone handed her anything. That part of her story is genuinely impressive. She tried out for WWE in 2014 but didn't get signed. She competed in the Mae Young Classic in 2017, had solid showings, but again, no major WWE deal materialized. Instead of sulking, she went to Impact Wrestling and made herself a star. Her peak came in 2020 when she defeated Sami Callihan to become the first woman in history to win a Men's World Heavyweight Championship in TNA. It was a legit, once-in-a-generation moment that could have been the beginning of her rise as wrestling's next biggest female star. Instead, it all fell apart. When the pandemic hit, Tessa reportedly no-showed Impact events and failed to send in promotional content they needed during the lockdown period. Impact stripped her of the title and terminated her contract. Around the same time, accusations of past bullying behavior toward fellow wrestlers surfaced on social media. The reports were damning enough that both AEW and WWE wanted nothing to do with her. She went from being the hottest free agent in women's wrestling to essentially being blacklisted in the span of weeks. She spent 2 years largely away from the business, resurfaced in CMLL in Mexico, and made her shocking return to TNA at Final Resolution in December 2024. As of January 2026, she's active in TNA's Knockouts division, trying to rebuild her reputation. Whether the redemption arc sticks or if she ends up blowing it will decide the next chapter of her wrestling career. But while Tessa's fall was largely self-inflicted, let's talk about a guy whose father's shadow was too perfect to escape. Curtis Axel had a serious lineage to live up to. His grandfather, Larry the Axe Hennig, was a territory-era powerhouse. His father, Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig, was one of the most well-known performers in wrestling history. Joe Hennig signed with WWE in 2007 and went through Florida Championship Wrestling. He debuted on the main roster in 2010 under the name Michael McGillicuddy, notably stripping away his famous surname, seemingly determined to make it on his own merit. The idea was admirable, but the execution was flat. Without the name and without a character, he was invisible. He bounced between mid-card obscurity and NXT for 3 years, racking up losing streak after losing streak. Then, in 2013, Vince rebooted him as Curtis Axel, combining his father's first name and his grandfather's nickname, and gave him Paul Heyman as a mouthpiece. And suddenly, Axel looked like a star. He beat Triple H and John Cena in the same week through cheap finishes and won the Intercontinental Championship at Payback, becoming the first father-son duo to both hold that title. It felt like the beginning of something special. But then WWE completely dropped the ball. Axel lost the title within months, drifted through forgettable tag partnerships with Ryback, Heath Slater, and Bo Dallas. He became a meme through Axelmania and spent the back half of his tenure as a jobber. He was released in April 2020, came back briefly as a producer in 2022 for 3 months, and that was it. 13 years in the WWE, 1 IC title reign, and a legacy he couldn't live up to. But going from a guy who couldn't get out of the undercard, let's talk about someone who never even got the chance to find out what he could have been. Richie Steamboat was, in many ways, the perfect wrestling prospect on paper. His father, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, is widely considered one of the greatest workers in the history of professional wrestling. Richie appeared ringside with his father at WrestleMania 4 as a toddler. He was a 4-time state champion and 2-time national champion in amateur wrestling. He trained under Harley Race. He toured Europe. He was signed by WWE in December 2009, went through Florida Championship Wrestling, and started winning titles. He won the FCW Tag Team Championship alongside Seth Rollins. He won the FCW Heavyweight Championship. And when FCW became NXT in 2012, Richie was one of the guys the brand was built around. He had a strong feud with Cassius Ohno and looked like a main roster call-up was waiting to happen. But then in November 2012, during a match on NXT, everything crumbled when he landed wrong on a moonsault. He lost feeling in his entire body from his chin down in an instant. The feeling gradually returned, but he'd herniated 3 discs and bruised his spinal cord. Doctors told him he should have been paralyzed. He wrestled through it for 6 months without telling many people, quietly managing one of the most serious spinal injuries in wrestling history, before finally sitting down and facing the reality. He couldn't even pick up his young son without pain. He was released in December 2013 and never wrestled again. He's now a stay-at-home father to 4 kids while his wife runs her own law firm. The tragedy isn't that he failed, it's that a back injury on a moonsault ended what might have been one of the more remarkable careers of his generation. But while Richie's story is genuinely heartbreaking, the next entry on our list is even more tragic. For decades, Jerry Lawler was the biggest wrestling star in the Mid-South region, drawing huge crowds in the territories, dominating the USWA, and eventually becoming the second most familiar voice in wrestling history alongside Jim Ross. In Memphis, he wasn't just a wrestler, he was a cultural icon. His son Brian Christopher grew up with that weight on his shoulders. He debuted in the USWA in the late 1980s and racked up 44 championships in the family promotion over the years. He was a legitimate star in Memphis before WWE ever called. When he arrived in WWE in 1997, he began teaming with Scott Taylor in a team called Too Much. In 1999, they became Too Cool, added Rikishi to the act, and the whole thing took off. Dancing, flashy outfits, genuinely over babyfaces during the Attitude Era. They captured the tag team titles from Edge and Christian in May 2000, and it was the peak of his wrestling career. Then, in 2001, Lawler was caught transporting illegal substances across the US-Canadian border and was released by WWE. He floated between independent promotions for the better part of the next decade and a half, with occasional nostalgia appearances, including a 2014 Raw reunion with Scotty 2 Hotty and Rikishi. But outside the ring, life was getting progressively harder. In July 2018, Lawler was arrested in Tennessee on DUI charges and placed in Hardeman County Jail. On July 29, 2018, corrections officers found him unresponsive in his cell, and he passed away at 46 years old. Jerry Lawler filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the county in 2019, but the case was eventually dismissed in September 2024. Brian Christopher never became the generational star that his father was. Instead, his story ended up becoming one of the darkest tales in wrestling history.